This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised, and we encourage self-care and seeking professional support as needed.
So civil societies, they're the gap between what member states should be doing in terms of providing services and aid or development work.
In this episode, I speak to Misconduct Kachambwa, Executive Director of Femnet, a civil society organization focusing on African women's development. She emphasizes the critical role of civil society organization on the front line even before aid or development work begins.
So most communities, especially sexual misconduct perpetrated by development workers, are also telling us that there is no trust in terms of whether, if they do report, there will be any action done.
As the voice of the community, she shares with us their fears and highlights the troubling reality of agencies' silence and inaction despite their authority, influence, and responsibility.
Silence from aid agencies, usually because they have power. So they have power to say, in this situation, we must be the ones to protect. We must be the ones to prevent. We must be the ones to call out. So that silence where it's happening, and yet they are not doing any action. It's a lot of PR.
This is the #NoExcuse podcast. We discuss the challenges, complexities, and potential solution in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the humanitarian and development sectors. You'll hear interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and Global PRS Network Coordinator for the department. Misconduct Kachambwa, welcome. And thank you for taking the time out of the WHO's annual stakeholder conference on the prevention and response to sexual misconduct in Geneva. I think your perspective as a civil society organization leader is invaluable. But before we dive into our conversation, could we just clarify what a civil society organization is and their role when it comes to the prevention and response to sexual misconduct in a humanitarian or development response?
Thank you so much, Guni, and thank you for having me on this podcast of No Excuse, and congratulations on the first ever conference. I'm so excited. I think this is really groundbreaking work that you're doing, where you're even inviting civil society already in the space on sexual exploitation, misconduct, and abuse. We've seen that the space to have civil society voices heard is shrinking. So I want to firstly really congratulate you in terms of having that ease of access to be in a space where there is interaction between member states, between UN agency, and it's at the same power. We could speak, we could interact. And I just wanted to state that, to say you've started really well by providing that, because in most cases we have no access to be able to be in the spaces where there are all the multilateral stakeholders and multiplicity of stakeholders. Now to your question, civil society. So civil society broadly are actors who work with communities in terms of social justice, in terms of different areas. And I will speak and say civil society is very diverse. It's not homogeneous. And we, in areas of development work, in areas of humanitarian or crisis situations, you get different types of civil society, human rights actors, service providers, all coming together. There's usually a notion particularly amongst development, humanitarian and aid agency, to have civil society just as implementing partners, coming right at the tail end. They have the least budgets in the whole programming, or they are just consulted as in a way which is very extractive. They'll come, they're testing a tool, they'll come to civil society. They want communities to come together, they'll come to civil society. They want to document, they'll come to civil society. But it's not in a collective, it's not in a co-creation way. And one of the key feminist principles is to really have co-creation and to recognize that civil society, frontline workers have the expertise and the knowledge to inform. Yeah. So I think for me to say civil society do have a unique role in the co-creation, even in the implementation, but in really linking together, in linking the development aid workers with the communities. And civil society is usually the first responders in any crisis. It's civil society that will come forth. It's civil society that who alert information. I'll give you an example. The situation currently in Sudan. We have seen civil society organizations coming together and saying, across the African continent, can we be the first ones to bring together whatever you have, to start having funds coming up? When there was Cyclone Idai in my country, Zimbabwe, where I came from, there was such quick response. People were giving clothes, people were bringing food. I'd never seen that before. Yeah. And this is the role where civil society has to trigger that action, to be the platform to say, let's make sure this happens. Right. Now I'm going into civil society. I need to come back into PRIS, right?
I think the civil societies know what local communities, beneficiaries, people that international organizations are supposed to serve. They know them, they know what they need, and they are with them, right? Yeah. And hence why you being in between and being that messenger as well to a certain extent is so valuable. Civil societies are also often seen as watchdogs, ensuring accountability. And what are some of the challenges that you see in the effort to address sexual exploitation and abuse for civil societies?
I mean, given the broadness of civil society, and really say as women's rights organizations, I'll speak from that perspective and say women's rights organizations have been really in the forefront in terms of conceptualizing, in terms of speaking up, and even having tools on the prevention and response to sexual harassment and misconduct. But the biggest challenge they really face is really around resourcing. So most of the time, because we are perceived to be implementing partners just to implement the activity, if it's distribution of food, if it's training, it's very specific. There isn't like institutional, organizational funding, core support for civil society to continue with the work. So civil society will be the first ones in terms of being first responded. They are the ones who are in the community where survivors to say they need to support the survivors. So one of the biggest challenges is already they are working to ensure that there are services. And I know usually services or shelters which are sort of like funded. So civil society in most cases, they have a gap. They are the gap between what member states should be doing in terms of providing services and also in terms of the programs for prevention of the violations. So already, even before, aid or development work, civil societies are there, women's rights organizations are usually there, but they receive the least funding. So that's usually the major challenge. So I think those are some of the challenges on perception of civil society not being included, not having a seat at the table, very low resources.
It sounds like civil societies, especially in this area, are in a place of scarcity, no funds, and they're in a place where As you said, it's where member states should have already been doing this, but it's not there. What are communities telling you about the issue of sexual misconduct?
So most communities, especially sexual misconduct perpetrated by development workers, most of the communities that what we hear is that there's no trust in terms of whether, if they do report, there will be any, in terms of action, much done. Communities are also telling us that most of the violations that happen are not prosecuted through legal instruments, and most of them, they are protected because of the immunities associated with development and aid workers. Communities are also telling us that prevention should also be strengthening the capacities of, could be civil society organizations within their own systems as well, because we know that violations happen in every organization, in every situation, but there isn't much commitment and political will for organizations and civil society also to strengthen that area, because strengthening should be really holistic. It should work within an ecosystem. I think we're also hearing communities telling us that there's an increase in the backlash in terms of gender equality. I think it's important to ensure that there's also more action in terms of calling out and speaking up on the shrinking and, the misogyny that happens in society as well. Because if we also start having member states, for example, or UN agencies that are not open enough to allow these conversations on the drivers of violence, whether it could be in the workspace, in society, in communities, to be addressed. Right. This is what we're hearing a lot from communities, to say, we just need more action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard you that they don't trust the system for something to be done. In terms of survivors, what are they saying? What are their experience?
Wow, that's really tough.
Yeah.
And I'll speak because my organization, Femnet, we work a lot at the policy level in terms of pushing for policies. But we hear a lot. So one of the biggest violations which we hear a lot is the silence. The silence where crises is happening, and there's silence, there is impunity. The UN aid workers are not doing anything. Silence from aid agencies, usually, because they have power. So they have power to say, in this situation, we must be the ones to protect. We must be the ones to prevent. We must be the ones to call out. So that silence where it's happening, and yet they are not doing any action. It's a lot of PR that happens. So I think most survivors, they really struggle with that. So there could be misconduct that happens, and a development agency can actually come in, do the hearings, the documentation and everything. But what happens afterwards? There's no reparations. Sometimes they're just left hanging. So 5 years later, you trusted a development work, the people who were supposed to be helping, you trusted them. There was violation, it was recognized, it was addressed by either removing or whatever, but there was no compensation. You still live with those wounds.
So but the also silence of the system, right?
System.
The system and the people who are in it, yeah.
Yeah, the whole structure of violence, where it's the structure is designed in a way where it violates survivors. And then what happens is, if it happens constantly without being addressed, then it becomes systemic, it becomes a system, it becomes a culture. Okay, so the feminist movement will really bring in, like I mentioned before, power analysis to really analyze the root cause. The feminist lens will challenge the oppressive system over and above. So sometimes development workers who are perpetrators, they're just racist, they're misogynist. They come from very patriarchal, oppressive systems and backgrounds, and they bring that into the space. So this is what feminist lens does. This is what the feminist movement actually challenges, to say, you may design the best policy, you may have the trainings, you may put everything, the house in order, but if those inherent power, structural, patriarchal, misogynistic, racist issues are not addressed, at the end of the day, where a lot of resources are being put in prevention for development workers who should not be doing what they're doing. But those resources could have done more for survivors. And another element is to say, one of the things we push for is for representation. Representation beyond just the numbers. So we know that when we have more women, the likelihood of having sexual misconduct or violation is much less. And I think we also heard from the conference some of data which is already showing that. So having more feminist leadership, more transformative leadership, and really survivor, victim-centered responses. The movement, feminist movement, it really pushes for solidarity. You will not get that much solidarity by any other movement. Where is the element for healing? Are we even budgeting for healing justice? Those circles of support, circles where there can be so much healing, not once off, but continuous healing. And this is where the women's rights organizations and the movement now take on in terms of reintegration and, strengthening the power, because survivors cannot stay down, but they have to get up and, be supported. So they need that safety net to be able to move on.
What you're saying is really what the feminist movement is bringing is another set of competency in understanding this issue of preventing and responding to sexual misconduct. So to close off, what would be an impact you'd want to see?
I think when it comes to impact, where we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't have 2-3 generations, 50, 100 years speaking about the same thing. For me, the impact would be when we put everything and we really take this seriously. There is investment that is holistic, that is inclusive, that is empowering in terms of really ending violations, sexual harassment. So an impact for me would be just really seeing this work translating to the community, to the household level, to society. We need more coordination as well in terms of within the agencies, but also more interaction, even among civil society.
That's true.
Because we can't just have this become elitist, but we need to spread. We need to spread the tools, we need to spread the resources. You need to advocate for more resources for us. We need more feminists in the space. I mean, you can just imagine how they'll light the room, the creative energies of really addressing it, but also confronting some of the gaps that are felt.
Love it,
but we are starting.
Yes.
I think it's a great start.
Thank you, Memory, for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
I hope one day we'll come and we won't be having this discussion.
Exactly.
We'll
it's not that we don't like each other, but
yes.
it's celebrating. Exactly.
We'll be having so much joy. It's living in a world where there's so much freedom to be.
That's right.
No fear. No excuse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We hope that for our children, no? Thank you for listening to this episode of the World Health Organization's #NoExcuse podcast. We hope we've given you another perspective on preventing and responding to sexual misconduct in the humanitarian and development sectors. We release new episodes every 2 weeks. But if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions in the meantime, feel free to reach out at prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.